Wait till she sees this.
It's over. But yeah, so getting Windows itself to work well as a standard user, and that, I mean, that in and of itself was a pretty tremendous effort, because there were a lot of chunks of Windows that were written with this complete reliance on running as an administrator that wasn't even explicit. Right? At least in most cases where we're talking about applications, they knew that they were sort of saying, yeah, we're expecting admins to run this. There were a lot of cases in Windows where it was just, coded move forward, it always operated with that assumption, and it just plain doesn't work well as a standard user. So there was that. Then there was getting the world, basically the world of applications, to run as a standard user.
Yeah.
What we largely did for that was when a user logs on as a member of the administrators group, we actually do some morphing under the covers, and we'll hit that, I guess, a bit more when we go into the tech details, but we actually run those administrators as a standard user until they need to do something administrative. And then, last but not least, because the world where everybody is running as a standard user all the time kind of falls apart when you need to do something administrative, was to provide an elevation mechanism that kind of bridges the gap from, okay, you're running in a standard user context to now you're running with your full power, right? It's sort of the superpowered user. You can do anything in this mode. And that's kind of the elevation prompt. I guess has sort of become synonymous with UAC at this point.
So it warns you. It says, hey, you're about to do something big here.
Exactly.
But that middle one is super important, where we, even though you've logged on as admin, we still run stuff as standard user.
That's interesting, yeah.
Yeah, so say you're a dev, and you normally, because you're a dev, you're an admin, there's just machismo down that path that it's tough to take away administrative from your devs. That means that they're running their applications that they use for compiling and etc. as admin, and that means they do all their testing as admin. That forces their testers to run as admin, which forces their users to run as admin. Now, accidentally, when you compile your code and you go to test it, you're testing it as standard user, and you're getting immediate feedback that your app isn't working well as standard user.
Yeah.
And now you have we've broken the first link in that vicious cycle of trying to ship standard user code.
Yeah. And I mean, also right on the very other end of the spectrum, the actual end user scenario. Right, when we were talking about Outlook running with full privileges and your dad sends you funny.exe, well, funny.exe is now running as a standard user because Outlook's running as a standard user because we're logging you on as a standard user. And so funny.exe can no longer hose the entire machine.
Right.
So
then if administrators are logged on as standard users, I mean, how do administrators actually log on as administrators?
You don't. But when you run an administrative task, now we bump you back up to your full administrative potential.
Is there any way to just shut the whole thing down so that administrators can just run and never have to deal with that prompt? Because it seems like, I mean, if I were an admin, I'd probably start to go kind of cuckoo, if I were constantly having to say, yes, let's go and do this and so on.
Sure. So, but let's poke at that for just a second. So what are you doing as an administrator? Are you installing stuff every day?
Managing users, managing IIS, managing SQL Server.
So you're talking about like an administrative enterprise admin.
Yeah, an actual admin. Yeah.
And there's some valid pain down that path that we have some example blogs on how we help you get MMC, for example, running without a prompt, etc. And there's ways that you could go into silent mode, etc. But once you're in silent mode, Internet Explorer will still be running at low.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
MMC will still be running standard user, but if I give you malware via your instant messenger, it's going to silently install. Right? So you have to ask yourself, are you willing to pay that price?
Right.
yeah, so I mean, just taking sort of one step back from there, right? Everything that we did that is tweakable with respect to UAC is exposed through the security policy snapping, right? So I think we have probably about 8 different settings at this point. There's the big switch, right, as I like to call it, which is, turn the whole thing on or the whole thing off. And when you turn the whole thing off, you lose the compatibility mitigations, right? Administrators are running as full admins the entire time. Standard users obviously still run as standard users, but there's no elevation mechanism anymore in between.
Okay.
The policy that Steve is mentioning is one where UAC is still on. So, right, you're an admin, you log on running as a standard user, but when you launch something administrative, you get no prompt on the back end to do that elevation. It just kind of does a silent elevation
That
for you.
is fascinating. So there are no real admins anymore? I mean, like, in terms of users, user accounts. I mean, they're logged in as administrator, but they're not really admins.
For interactive logons, yes. There is one exception to the rule, which is the built-in administrator.
Okay.
Right, and then kind of the capital A administrator. And the reason for that one is that account historically has been the kind of account of last resort. And so we wanted to keep the semantics for that, thought that was important. The account is disabled by default in Vista. So, you know, at that point you've kind of gone through extra effort to go and re-enable the account and then log on as that account. So we figure at that point you're probably doing something that really requires you to just be able to fix the system.
Okay.
And so that one we just left alone.
And if you're a domain admin or an enterprise admin, you shouldn't be logging on with your domain admin creds interactively anyway. You should be using your standard user creds, reading your email, and then you TS to that box with those domain admin creds.
Okay.
Right? That's kind of a similar split. The reason we have this easy bump from non-admin to admin if you log on interactively as admin is in case you still have some XP app that has to have admin for some compatible reason. Right? So now you run that one game that we can't get running as standard user. You can bump up to administrator and still be you while you run that game. You know.
Okay, but for the most part, it sounds like just running as standard user the whole time, really.
Right.
Have you guys gone out and tested and, I mean, do you have like a bucket of viruses and Trojans and worms and stuff that you've thrown at this system?
Sure.
By any chance? And how are we doing? I mean, how's it faring?
It well, does great against the iPhone. In general, so viruses, malware are kind of they're a very interesting case because most of them at this point, you know, they do need administrative privileges. They want machine access, or they've just always had it, so they've always kind of coded for it. The same story. At the same time, the folks that are out there writing malware are some of the most kind of adaptive and flexible programmers, right? Because that's what they expect. They expect a security patch to come down, and you know, one avenue of entry is closed. They need to go hit another one. Yeah. So we actually fully expect that a lot of those folks are revving their malware to run per user rather than per machine.
But the big issue with this is not whether or not malware will get through, because we're not touting it as a security technology yet. Okay. Right, and we're tightening it up. We're going to continue the isolation until it is a security technology. The point of this is to get ISVs to engage and write standard user code. Okay. In other words, if I make you a full standard user, because I've installed, you know, you're my kid and I've installed games for you and I've turned on parental controls and I've said you can't install anything that I didn't say you could run, you become a much more isolated kid that has much less potential to attack the machine. As long as our ISVs start targeting that persona, that person that can only be standard user, everything starts coming into place that just makes it easier to run Windows as standard user. Our enterprise customers, right now 30% report that they're at about 70% standard user, which isn't a huge number, but they plan in the next 5 years to get to 70% running 100% standard user. So this will, as an ISV, that more or less says, if you don't engage, you'll stop being able to sell to those enterprises.
Interesting. Okay. Who then are the remaining 30%? I mean, who do they typically like to keep running as admin?
Well, developers, you know, they just feel that they're super important and therefore they have to be admin.
You keep pointing over here, and it's
Steve will continue to point over here as long as I'm the only other one in a chair. So, I mean, there are some shops where, you know, there are some shops that are still on Windows 95, Windows 98, for example, and so those are folks where, you know, kind of security and centralized management of kind of, you know, end user desktops is not quite on the forefront. Yeah. You look at some of the larger corporations though, where you're talking about, you know, I mean, certainly over 10,000 desktops, but we have some that are 100, 200,000 desktops. And the cost of ownership per desktop is significantly lower on an annual basis if you're running the user as a standard user. Right? It means that now your end user desktop can't go and demolish the entire machine and require a reinstall, right? Because they installed who knows what. And also from sort of an enterprise lockdown standpoint, it means they can't go and install arbitrary applications from home.
Well, ISVs then could kind of tout their applications, you know, written for standard mode as being cost saving, just because.
Or I'm not the path that your machine gets owned.
Yep.
Right.
Or yep. I can be run in your enterprise. It really is kind of like a huge market there, especially because now more and more enterprises are starting to say, you know, we are not going to buy software that does not run as a standard user.
That's actually fantastic. I mean, the idea that security problems can be taken and turned around and turned into a business opportunity, you know,
Yeah.
for the ISPs, they can actually tout that as a feature. I mean.